Jason and I, in planning for this, we did a little bit of research and did some searching, and folks have done some things about what the world of sports looks like. We're just going to throw a couple things out, and then we'll get into discussion with you. One of them, people are saying in the future, is that there'll be augmented reality, life-size replays up close and fully realized 3D in theater-sized venues.
And that's when you're actually watching a game. What if we're talking about esports? We could have the highest percentage of participation of any sport in human history.
You could have major networks boxed out as leagues, players, franchises, and fans become content kings.
You could be watching a game through a headset that puts you in the helmet of your favorite quarterback.
And maybe one last one. Enhanced athletes and natural athletes, they're going to compete in separate leagues like amateur and pros. So there's a lot that people are speculating. Kathy, let's start with you. On our planning call, and we said, are we in a new era of sports? You said, of course we are.
Yeah, no, there's no question that we are. I mean, let that catch up to me, but you know, when you think about what's happening in sport and the intersection between sport and technology, the way that fans are experiencing the game, and I think so much, and we're seeing it this weekend even as we're here, there's so much that's being evolved. Now, when I think about that as it relates to the Olympics, it's just a massive landscape of opportunity for us, because the Olympics is a little bit more traditional, a little bit more how the game actually is played inside the white lines or inside the pool. And so the opportunity to see that what is happening in sport here and across the world now translate into what happens in the Olympics and the Paralympics, pretty special opportunity.
So George, I feel like when we talk about a new era in sports, we can just sort of go down the list. It's a new era of all things sports. You and I were talking a little bit backstage about that, and I threw a few things at you. Media, it feels like, is totally different. This is a world you've worked in and around for a long time. How does the new world of media intersect with the new world of sports?
Well, technology is disrupting everything. Sports is no different. And what technology is allowing fans to do is interact directly with the sport that they love through social and digital media, and also with the personalities. And the way people consume content today is quite differently than they did 5 or 10 years ago. And so everyone's going to have to adapt. And if they don't, they're going to fall behind. So it's really more one-to-one and on all different platforms.
But how do you do that? How do you get to one-to-one, especially in this era? And I think this is going to be a theme throughout the course of the day, where, you know, we can get to so many people, but that individualization, that ability to really connect in a meaningful, authentic, intimate way, however you want to describe it, it's hard.
Well, you know, we run for the National Football League, their international OTT in 181 countries, but we are selling subscribers one subscriber at a time. So I know, and when I'm selling a subscriber, what ads work, what ads don't work. I know at what price they'll buy something and what price they won't buy something. And today we're selling a season of content and also individual games, but someday you're going to be selling t-shirts, hats, gaming, gambling, and a whole suite of services. And the OTT is the tip of the spear, meaning I know I'm selling one subscriber at a time game content, but it's going to be a lot broader. And so understanding what a fan wants and giving them products and services and content that they want, to me, is going to be critical. And also, you think about selling tickets, hospitality, how sponsorships are valued, are all going to be changed through this dynamic.
Well, Kathy, come in on this, because if I think of the Olympic Games, I think sponsorships, I think about so many different things that George just mentioned. How do you approach it?
Well, I think he's exactly right, and I think the ability to understand more your consumer and the insights around that consumer allows you to serve the fan or the consumer so much more effectively. And that's, like I said, that is super green space for us, because that's not traditionally the way that the Olympics or the Paralympics has actually delivered the games themselves to the fans. And so we have a mantra internally that, you know, we've got to evolve from protect and control what goes on around the Olympics to empower and support. So in fact, when we think about one-to-one, it's not just
protect and control to power and support.
Empower and support. So empower the fan or the consumer or the athlete to actually tell the story more effectively. And those are things that are, again, they're new in the Olympic and Paralympic space, but we believe that that's going to allow us that greater connectivity, and then data, insights, we're going to be able to serve them more effectively.
All right, let's talk about empowerment of the athlete. George, this is something you understand from when you ran IMG. I mean, even back then, you were starting to get a taste of what the empowered athlete would be like. We're going to hear from some of them later on in this program. We spent a lot of time with some empowered athletes over the past couple days here in Miami. This is a new world. You think about the NBA, especially the brands, and I dare say Kobe Bryant was a leader in that regard. You think about LeBron, you think about Chris Paul, even some football players. You think about Gronk. What is it that has happened, and where does this go from here? What are the implications of this empowered athlete?
Well, technology, again, is allowing people to produce their own content and go directly to the fan.
Yeah.
20 years ago, I had to go through my local TV station or my local newspaper or maybe the radio. Today, the athlete can go directly to the fan through all kinds of things, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever it might be, through social and digital media. They're now a content provider. And in many cases, they've got a lot of Twitter followers, and they're their own platform. So technology has created a platform for athletes that never existed before. And if you really think about it in business, that's going to be the most powerful influencer going forward. Athletes, by definition, are influencers, and so there's a real opportunity, but there's also a little risk sometimes too.
Okay, good.
This is what I was going to say. Good thing or problematic?
Well, I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Cristiano Ronaldo just went over 200 million Instagram followers. I mean, that's not something you now shut off.
That's mostly just from him taking his shirt off, right?
Fair enough,
Let's
and
be
I'll
honest.
admit that's
And rightfully
that's
so.
enticing. But you look at that, and you can't say it's bad because it's here.
Yeah.
And so we then have to determine and figure out the best way to lean into that, go back to this, and how do you protect the brand, but ultimately allow those that have the greatest voices to continue to tell a story. And it's complicated, but that you can't put it back, and you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
You can't, but let's push it a little further, because I do think we're in this time where, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's China, and there are definitely, very strong views about what's right and wrong, and yet these are also markets, China in particular, the NBA, they want to be in. What's the balance between right and wrong here?
I think that's the razor's edge that we're all trying to find. And I think that we're seeing that real time, whether it's the NBA situation. For us, if we continue to define what the brand for, in my case, as we think about the journey towards Los Angeles in 2028, if we define what it is that we want to be and how we want to be reflected, we have to own that brand, but we actually have to co-create with the next generation of fans, because if we don't, then they aren't going to see us as authentic. So I think that's the challenge, and we've seen this whether it's in our brands. Should brands or leaders be involved in the future state of geopolitical events?
Right.
I don't think we can say no, because they are.
Well, George, you talked a lot about, you've got 4 kids, and how they consume media, how they consume sports.
Very different than when I did. I mean, we were talking the other day on the phone. So George Bodenheimer used to run ESPN. He came over to my house for dinner one night, and I had 2 boys. ESPN was on all the time, but my little daughter hated ESPN. She called it PSEN, and she said, "I'm not going to be nice to that man when he comes for dinner." And that's how much ESPN dominated our house. But today, ESPN is not on, and nor is any other sports network. They're consuming their news and information through their devices. And so if you want to be relevant to that generation, you're going to have to deliver content to them on the platforms that they're relating to. My kids, for example, 15 to 22, Barstool. If you're with them, they're constantly on Barstool. So I don't know what that says about my children, and I'm kind of old, but they're consuming it differently, very differently than we did 5, 10, 15 years ago.
So what does it mean for linear television and media rights?
Well, listen, I mean, we both would say, obviously, sport is still something that you want to consume live, but you can also get cut-down versions of sport. You can actually see the gold medal winning race, and you can watch it again and again. But there is always, but to be fair, there isn't anyone that's just linear anymore. I mean, the variety, they're content providers, and we, as our partnership with NBC, they say, look, we will deliver through whatever means or method people consume the Olympic Games. whatever that is today, whatever that is tomorrow, and whatever that is in the future?
I think it's going to have I think sports are going to do great. A bunch of rights are coming up. Because sports aggregates large audiences of engaged consumers, the NFL is going to do great. The hockey is going to do great. We know the PGA Tour is going to do a big deal. You saw the Southeastern Conference for a Saturday afternoon window went from $50 million a year to $330, just not for exclusivity, but for one game. So sports is going to do robust in the next media cycle. The question, though, just like when you used to do a deal, how much cable, how much network, and if you took the money on cable, you had less exposure than you did on network. So when I was at NASCAR, and we were on NBC and Fox, we had much better distribution than you might have on a cable provider. And when you took the cable money, you knew you were getting less distribution and less promotion. So the question in the new world is, if I take the old world money, what happens to those kids I was just talking about who are not consuming content on that distribution platform? And so the yin and the yang for the leagues is going to be, how much do I want the money versus how much do I want to be able to be relevant to a whole generation of consumers that they need to reach. And remember, the competition for sports and entertainment is not just other sports or entertainment, it's social media. It's how much time are they on that device. And if you as a property are not relevant on that device, it's hard for me to see how you're going to be relevant 5, 10, 15 years from now. And so striking the balance between short-term money with old media and relevancy on the new media, to me, is much like network versus cable 20 years ago.
Well, and this is going to be a question we get into a little bit later in the afternoon with John Skipper, who knows a lot about this, both from his previous job and obviously his current job at DAZN. You guys were talking about something a minute ago that I think is worth exploring. You talked about the empowered athlete. You talked about some of the institutions and the effect and the risk. I do wonder about the owners of those teams across the league. And George, you and I have talked about this a lot. You know a lot of the owners, and by virtue of what we do on Wall Street, we know a lot of the owners. This is a new generation that's coming up. The whole notion of ownership has changed, and we're going to talk with Kim Pegula later, but the types of people and the approach that they've had to owning sports teams has been radically transformed. What are the implications of that for the business, for valuations, and for how these teams are operated?
Well, I think people buy teams for different reasons. I think one of the most interesting things coming up is you're going to have the ability now in Major League Baseball to buy a limited partnership across 30 teams. And I also think in the National Basketball Association, you're going to be able to do the same thing. So that's very different than before. So I think more and more demand is going to come in, and more money is going to come in and raise the valuation of these teams. So I think it's a unique time. I think you're going to see less and less families and maybe more institutional investors over the next 5 or 10 years.
And so play that out for us. So if your ownership is much more spread, if there's not a Bob Kraft type ownership model anymore, and it's more a syndicate of people who are doing it more as an investment, maybe they're doing it partially as a fan, what do you think are the implications of how that team is run?
I think there'll always be a Bob Kraft, but I think he's going to have a different group of limited partners. So, and they're going to, because, when you start spending, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion, the air gets thin up there in terms of who the potential buyers are, and it depresses the value. So by allowing a new class of buyers, it's actually going to increase the value. And if you go back and look at the compounded annual growth of team valuations, it's over 20 years, it's been double-digit growth. So there aren't a lot of things that have given double-digit growth over a 20-year period. So teams are good investments. And by changing the vehicle, they're having a broader group of people that can invest at a time when those valuations are so high.
Well, speaking of investment, Kathy, you've got, I think, a $5 billion budget that you've got to fund. I don't know if I've got the right number.
5, 6.5.
5, 6.5.
Somewhere in that
billion
neighborhood.
here, billion.
A couple billion here, a couple billion
So you do sponsorships, you do a lot of things. Tell us about the environment for that.
It's been interesting from my perspective. I've been doing this now just over a year, and the power of the Olympic movement is really remarkable. And we were talking a little bit about this before. That being said, the opportunity to innovate is even more powerful. And so what we have looked at is the power of the intellectual property is there, but how we now surround that with more value and more assets and more opportunity culminating in Los Angeles, one of the most important markets in the world, and certainly one of the most diverse. It's been surprising in a lot of regards how many people are very interested both in what it is we're doing, ultimately culminating in Los Angeles, but even the timeline that we have.
And, pick up on that, George, because you and I go back to like living in Atlanta at the same time. Atlanta is an incredible and interesting and diverse city. Obviously, you lived in Charlotte, but, with NASCAR. These are different sorts of cities. Cities are coming to the fore in many ways. I look around, where we are in this part of Miami versus where we were yesterday at Miami Beach Convention Center. This is an incredibly diverse part. It's a new era in cities in many ways. How does that play through to the sports world?
Well, I just think when you look at LA now, to me, what they're going to do with the Olympics is transformative, right? And I think LA, to me, has all the good of America in a way in terms of representing what that city stands for and how they'll host the world. And, look, Paris worked hard to get the Olympics in 2024, and a lot of people have tried hard to get the World Cup to come to the U.S. And obviously the Middle East is hosting the World Cup as well. So these events and these sports events kind of define a city, who they are and what they stand for.
I was just going to say, what's interesting from our perspective is, from LA, it truly isn't, diversity is about the city, because it is truly the most diverse place that exists. I mean, Miami is wonderfully diverse as well. And we look at the opportunity that we have to represent actually not just California, not just Los Angeles, but actually the entirety of our country. It's a generational opportunity to actually showcase what's best in what our country represents, as opposed to the divisiveness. And that's actually the power of the Olympics, is the power to bring people together.
Well, and it's interesting, one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later on too is sustainability. And I know you, Kathy, think a lot about what's the impact that the Olympics leave on the host city.
Yeah. Well, we think of radical reuse, as we call it, because in most cases you actually have to build a lot. In the case of Los Angeles, we have an embarrassment of riches, and so we don't have to build a thing. So whether it's the Athlete Village will be hosted by UCLA and the student dormitories there, to SoFi Stadium, the Coliseum, Staples Center, the new Clippers Stadium. I mean, there's a litany of opportunity for us, and we don't have to do anything. So it does create opportunity for us then to actually focus on, start to talk about how are we a carbon neutral games, if not carbon positive, because we actually have the ability and the time, and we're not building anything, to determine how do we actually deliver that as a part of our journey, which is something that we feel very confident we'll be able to do.
So George, when you think about the sort of firm that you're trying to build and create, you are building and creating, where are the buying and selling opportunities right now? Like, give us a sense of where your head is. I know I think recently just sold on-site.
On location.
On location, excuse me. That's a very person-to-person, human-based thing. Balance out and we've been talking a lot about this, sort of the human piece of this versus data versus technology, because you've got a lot of fingers and a lot of pies here.
So our thesis is we're investing behind the disruption in technology. So every decision or every acquisition we've made has been informed by that. So On Location, which we just sold, was a live event company, because as media becomes fragmented, things that people go to from their home are more valuable. We invested in Delta Tray, which is a global technology company, because we felt like the technology was changing and they were a global provider. We invested in The Athletic with Courtside. It's one of our best investments we've ever made. We just bought a data company from London called Two Circles, which represents all the federations outside the United States. Data management, again, looking at ticketing, hospitality, OTTs, and sponsorship valuation. So I believe technology is changing the game, and we're investing behind those changes. Here's an odd one. We invested in a design company. Why? Because in a direct-to-consumer world, it's all about design. You could say Apple's a design company, or Nike's a design company. So direct-to-consumer is all about design. So the way we look at it, we're going to be investing in and around where we think those opportunities are.
And Kathy, when it comes to technology, I mean, what's the next level for the Olympics in terms of the use of technology to make the experience, the fan experience, better?
Well, actually, the bar's kind of low today. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. It just means, it's really it's really hard to put on an event that brings this many people, 14,000 athletes together. And so we're looking at starting with just what I'd classify as table stakes. It'd be great if you can get your ticket on whatever device or whatever the mechanism is by 2028. If the athletes don't have to worry about losing the key to their room. I mean, so it's simple things actually will change the experience both of the fan and the athlete, but we'll go even further. And our expectation is to be able to deliver what is sort of status quo in sports today, whether it's a vertical experience around merchandise and how and what we do to deliver more connectivity and access. So we're excited, but we don't want to go too far too fast, because what's 2028 going to look like? So we'll work on sort of, like I said, table stakes, but be in a position to take advantage of as technology continues to evolve.
So George, what do you worry? You're in the business of investing behind disruption. What's the disruption you most worry about in your business?
Well, just that you don't want to have an outdated technology, or that the investment you make yourself is somehow disrupted.
Yeah.
So to me, it's the unknown with technology, and so far so good, but that's what you worry about, that somehow you've made a bad judgment or a mistake, and eventually I'm going to make a big mistake,
right.
But so far I haven't, so I'm thankful for that.
And Kathy, how much do you worry about politics? You know, we're living in a world, you know, especially geopolitically, that is, to say the least, uncertain and ever-changing.
Or take it, the virus.
Right.
Like, God forbid, you know, it's terrible what's going on right now, but you've got an Olympic game, and you have to think about these things.
Well, let me back up for a second, because when we talk about politics, I think the key thing from our perspective is the athletes, no matter what part of the world, no matter what their religious background is, no matter what their socioeconomic background is, the rules of sport and the sport that they will compete in is exactly the same for the men and for the women, for whatever country you've come from. So in that sense, that's the beautiful thing about it, is that it brings people together from such diverse populations to showcase that we are more alike than we are dissimilar, and that's the power of the Olympics. So that, from our perspective, sort of mitigates to some degree all of the other noise that I would classify as out there. Now, obviously, we have to be aware of everything else, but that's certainly, you know, as we think about it, that's the beauty of it. But the reality is, as an organizer, you have to be prepared for everything. And fortunately, we're far enough out. We haven't started all of that, but every day we get closer, we start to work on the contingencies of everything that happens and could happen.
So, we're almost running out of time. So, George, finish the sentence. The next era of sports is what?
It's all about the consumer. It's all about the consumer experience at home and in the venue.
Kathy, the next era of sports, the next era of the Olympics is about?
I agree with him. I mean, if we can't figure out how to deliver to the consumer and the next generation of fans what they are most interested in, they will find it somewhere else.
All right, who do you like on Sunday?
My heart is with the Kansas City Chiefs, because the president of the Chiefs, Mark Donovan, was a quarterback on my college football team.
Right.
But my head says San Francisco.
All right.
Kathy?
Is there a soccer game going on? I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding.
Well, your soccer background.
Yeah, my background is in that. No, I would say I'm going for the Chiefs this Sunday.
Interesting.
With the Hunt family, it's been a long time since they have been in the big game. Would love to see the legacy back with the Hunt family.
All right. George, Pyne, Kathy, thank you
so
much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.